March 21st, 1945. Over southern Germany's jagged skyline at 8:02 a.m., the sky tore itself open. A silver blur carved through the high-altitude haze, leaving behind a contrail that looked like a slash across the heavens. The Allied escort squadron had just begun their patrol above Bavaria. 15 Mustangs cruising at 25,000 feet, calm, routine, silent, until a blip appeared. Then another. Then nothing. Captain Glenn Harris blinked twice behind his goggles. What the hell was that? It didn't bank, it didn't wobble, it just tore past them, streaking westward faster than anything they had seen before. At first, they thought it might be a Me-262, but it was higher, cleaner, and far, far faster. Major Dempsey clicked on the radio. Unidentified aircraft. Repeat. Visual on unknown jet. Bearing 280. Altitude 28. Speed unknown. Static. Then control snapped. No Allied aircraft in that corridor. Repeat, no scheduled flights. You're alone. Dempsey hesitated. Then what did we just see? Down below in the forests outside Munich, another message crackled to life. This one on a scrambled field channel. It didn't come from an airbase. It came from a makeshift airfield surrounded by barbed wire and blackout tents. No insignia. No authorization. Inside the hastily converted hangar sat a beast that wasn't supposed to exist. A stripped-down fuselage, mismatched panels, and a front intake that looked carved with a crowbar. It had no paint, no name. Just one man in a leather jacket climbing into the cockpit like it was his last chance to prove the laws of war wrong. His name was Thomas "Red" Halley, an airframe technician turned outlaw. A man who had seen too many bureaucratic delays, too many pilots die because they were waiting for permission to innovate. So he built something forbidden, something fast. Using salvaged parts from a crashed Gloucester Meteor, a damaged P-80 shooting star, and a ramjet assembly that no one had claimed ownership of, Halley created the Frankenjet, a monstrosity of aviation ambition that was never meant to fly, and definitely never meant to be seen. But that morning, he didn't ask. He lit the engine, peeled down the crude runway, and launched. And in those few seconds of ascent, he became the fastest man over Europe. Radar techs on both sides saw it. U.S. controllers logged a speed that didn't make sense, over 700 mph. German posts near Regensburg called it in as a new Allied terror weapon. The Luftwaffe scrambled jets in vain. No one caught him. No one even got close. And by the time Harris's squadron blinked their confusion into silence, Halley had already disappeared into the blue. Officially, the aircraft never existed. The flight was never recorded. The project had no file. But the men who saw that silver streak knew what they witnessed. Not fear, not fantasy. Flight rewritten by one man, who refused to follow the rules. Ask anyone who remembers the closing year of World War II, and they'll tell you the jet was Hitler's final card. The Me-262 streaking across the skies at 559 mph became the ultimate symbol of Nazi innovation. With swept wings and twin turbines, it outpaced every piston engine the Allies had. Bombers were torn apart in seconds. Fighters could barely react, let alone catch up. The Luftwaffe may have been collapsing, but its jets looked like something from the future. The myth was born, and it stuck. The Germans had the jets, the Allies did not. But myths simplify, and this one hid a dangerous truth. The Allies weren't behind. They were divided. The U.S. had the P-80 shooting star in development, a clean, sleek jet that promised to reach 600 mph. Britain had the Gloucester Meteor, already operational by 1944. But both were shackled by politics, production delays, and safety boards. Every modification had to be approved, every test logged, every breakthrough diluted by inter-service rivalries and corporate turf wars. And in the middle of this friction was a small breed of airframe mechanics, men like Thomas "Red" Halley. They weren't scientists, they didn't wear officer stripes. But they knew the guts of every aircraft like they knew the lines on their palms. They could hear when airflow was wrong, smell when fuel mixture was off, And sometimes, they could see what the engineers missed. Halley had watched footage of the Me-262 with growing frustration. He believed, no, knew that America could outrun the Germans. The tech existed. The turbines were ready. But paperwork, risk aversion, and pride were keeping progress grounded. So he stopped asking for permission. At a joint airfield in eastern France, Halley began pulling discarded components, parts from a damaged British Meteor, sections of a scrapped P-80, even a partial intake from an experimental ramjet. What he built wasn't pretty. It wasn't even legal. But it had everything it needed to fly fast. And that's the part of the story no one wanted told. Because if the U.S. had already built something faster than the Me-262 and buried it, that would raise questions. About the defense industry, about priorities, about how innovation sometimes comes from the lowest ranks, and how institutions would rather hide breakthroughs than admit they came from the wrong hands. The myth of German jet supremacy persisted because it was clean, simple, dramatic. But Halley's jet, cobbled together in a blackout hangar without a serial number or a sponsor, was faster. And when it streaked past Allied squadrons that March morning in 1945, the myth cracked. They didn't know his name. They weren't supposed to see his plane. But for 3 minutes, every pilot in that sky knew the truth. The Germans weren't the only ones with jets. They just weren't the only ones who lied about them. It didn't start with blueprints. It started with broken things. In a forgotten maintenance hangar on the outskirts of Chaumont, France, late 1944, spare parts were everywhere, stacked, rusting, miscategorized, engine fragments, bent airframes, panels marked "Do Not Use." The war had reached a point where logistics could barely keep up, and supply depots became graveyards for both failed prototypes and battlefield wreckage. For most, it was junk. For Thomas "Red" Halley, it was a gold mine. Halley was no engineer. He wasn't a test pilot nor a ranked officer. He was a crew chief with dirty boots, scarred knuckles, and a reputation for bending the rules until they snapped. Where others saw broken machines, he saw possibility. The P-80 program was still in its infancy, and the British Gloucester Meteor had a poor climb rate at high altitude. But Red didn't care about doctrine. He cared about speed, so he started building what the brass said couldn't be built. He salvaged a stripped-down F-5 Lightning frame, light, agile, and long out of rotation. From an abandoned British test engine, he pulled an intact Whittle turbojet core. It had burn marks, but the turbine spun true. Then came the nose intake, a mangled cone from a downed Arado 234 jet bomber. Halley reshaped it with nothing but a blowtorch, a steel press, and a sledgehammer. The airflow wasn't textbook, but it worked. The fuel tanks, scavenged from auxiliary drop tanks, modified for high-pressure feed. The cockpit, cannibalized from a grounded P-47. Every panel was bolted by hand, every rivet double-checked by Halley himself. There were no design reviews, no test data, only intuition and fire. He called it the Devil's Dart. Most on base thought it was a joke. That thing'll shake apart before it lifts off. The wings aren't balanced. You'll get court-martialed before you get clearance. But Halley wasn't asking for clearance. The war was in its bloodiest phase. The Battle of the Bulge had drained Allied resources. Pilots were dying faster than replacements could arrive. Jet attacks were increasing. Speed was no longer an advantage. It was a necessity. And in that chaos, one man decided to act. Over 3 weeks, Halley worked through the nights, sleeping in the hangar, welding by moonlight. Only a skeleton crew knew what he was doing. A fuel specialist, a radar tech, a kid who'd been busted down for insubordination but knew how to fine-tune turbine flow. They didn't write anything down. They didn't have to. Every part of the Devil's Dart was in their hands, their ears, their instincts. And on March 21st, 1945, with the sun just bleeding into the Alps, Halley fired the ignition. The hangar shuddered. The makeshift jet roared, ragged, angry, alive. Against every rule and every prediction, it lifted off the tarmac like a bullet from a bent barrel. No flight plan, no permission, only speed. Speed isn't subjective. Speed is numbers. And when those numbers break the rules of war, they leave behind scars that data can't hide. The Me-262, the pride of the Luftwaffe, was fast. Fast enough to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. At 559 mph, it outran every Allied fighter. Its swept wings and dual Jumo 004 turbines allowed it to strike without warning and vanish before defenders could react. It turned the sky into a killing field where only jets survived. Next came the Gloucester Meteor, Britain's attempt to keep pace. It reached 600 mph in tests, but high-altitude stability was unreliable. Its frame buckled under G-force strain. It flew, yes, but it didn't fight well. It was deployed mostly to chase V-1 rockets, not German fighters. Then the Americans arrived with the P-80 Shooting Star. Sleek, fast, elegant, but delayed. Too many redesigns, too many delays. It wouldn't see real combat in World War II. On paper, it could approach 620 mph. On the battlefield, it remained a whisper. And then came Halley's Devil's Dart, clocked at 740 mph. Radar logs confirmed it. 3 Allied stations in eastern France captured its signature. The intake geometry was unstable but fierce, creating a burst thrust effect similar to early afterburners. The ramjet inlet, hammered into place with little more than intuition, acted like a pressure amplifier. Speed built exponentially once the Dart broke 400 mph. By the time it cleared 30,000 feet, it was dragging shockwaves behind it. But the numbers didn't just beat the Germans. They terrified the Allies. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. The P-80 cost $500,000 per unit. It took 18 months of testing, 6 corporate contractors, and full Pentagon oversight. Halley's jet? A few $1,000s in scrap, welded in secret by a mechanic who'd never logged a test flight. And yet it flew higher, faster, harder. Military procurement officers called it an anomaly. Engineering divisions labeled it a risk multiplier. But pilots? Pilots called it the future. Because for them, speed meant life. A 30% edge in velocity meant a 100% better chance of surviving an ambush, dodging flak, or outturning a 262. But Halley's numbers weren't clean. His plane vibrated at low altitudes. It left thermal scars on the fuselage. Its unregulated fuel mix left a black chemical trail visible for miles. It was ugly, brutal, unstable. And still, no other plane came close. 740 mph wasn't a number. It was a threat. A threat to everything the Allied aerospace industry stood on. Because if one man could build this with scrap, what had the entire war machine been doing for 3 years? When the reports reached command, they didn't ask how it worked. They asked, how do we make this disappear? It was still dark when Halley rolled the Devil's Dart out onto the makeshift runway. The hangar lights were off. The only illumination came from the moonlight bouncing off the jet's unfinished metal skin. There were no orders, no flight plan, just 3 crewmen, watching history break every protocol. Halley didn't speak as he strapped in. The cockpit had no pressurization, no radio link to command, just a taped altimeter, a rewired throttle, and a modified ignition switch that had been cannibalized from a British bomber. He took one long breath, then flipped it. The engine caught fire, literally. For a full second, a sheet of flame rolled out of the intake and curled around the nose cone. Everyone watching thought it would explode. Instead, the turbine caught, roared, and settled into a banshee scream. The Dart shook, rattled, then surged forward, its wheels screeching across patched tarmac as wind peeled dust and gravel into the air. Halley had no clearance, no tower guidance. He hit 120 mph in 7 seconds, 215. And then, lift. The nose pitched up just barely. The tail snapped free of gravity and suddenly, impossibly, it was airborne. The flight log would later estimate it left the ground at 230 mph. But the radar team on the nearby ridge clocked it at 310 before it even cleared 300 feet. The dart climbed like a lightning bolt. With a stripped-down frame and raw thrust tunneling through its custom inlet, the aircraft accelerated without mercy. At 12,000 feet, it was doing 450 mph. At 18,000 feet, it was past 600. The tail assembly began to vibrate. The canopy shook so violently that Halley's teeth clacked in his jaw. But he didn't pull back. He leaned into the throttle and held. At 31,000 feet, he leveled off. Thin air, black sky, frost forming on the canopy seams. Then he did the unthinkable. He punched the throttle again. The dart jumped forward like it had been hit by a cannon. A microburst of turbo pressure kicked in through the intake cone, compressing airflow past the turbine and effectively simulating early-stage afterburn. Radar logged it, 740 mph, 30% faster than any aircraft on Earth. Halley had no way of knowing the exact number. But he could feel it. The silence. The tremble of the controls. The way the air didn't resist. It shredded. Ground control didn't know what it was. U.S. radar stations called it an anomaly. German posts called it an Allied prototype, possibly British. Radio chatter exploded. Command centers scrambled. And in the sky, Halley just turned, banked left, descended in a slow arc back toward the ridge. The frame whined. The engine coughed smoke, but the plane held. At 10,000 feet, he spotted his own hangar, just a rectangle of black among the trees. He pulled back, throttled down, and aimed for the dirt strip. Landing gear was unreliable, so he kept the front wheel locked. The dart slammed into the ground like a hammer, bounced once, then skidded to a stop, plowing through crates and splintered wood. Silence. Then steam. Then sparks. And then the hatch opened, and Halley climbed out. Not a word. Not a celebration. Just a nod to his stunned crew. Because he knew what he'd just done. Not a test, not a prototype. A weapon. One that broke the sound barrier of bureaucracy and scared both sides of the war. It only took one unauthorized flight to break the math of war. Before March 21, 1945, the equation was simple. The Luftwaffe held the speed edge with their Me-262s. The Allies countered with numbers and altitude tactics. German jets were feared, but few. Allied fighters were slower, but many. In raw numbers, it balanced out. Then came the Devil's Dart. When radar stations recorded a friendly aircraft hitting 740 mph, 180 mph, faster than any Allied fighter, and nearly 200 mph faster than the Me-262, that balance disintegrated. The dart had shattered not only the speed gap, but the entire air superiority calculus. In war, advantage is measured in seconds, and Halley had just bought the Allies 20 of them. Every command center from Normandy to Naples scrambled to verify the data. Could it be Soviet? Was it German tech restolen? Had the British deployed a Black Ops prototype? It wasn't any of those. It was worse. It was American, built from their own scrapyards, by one of their own mechanics. And if that was true, it meant the entire procurement chain, every delay, every canceled contract and white paper study, had just been leapfrogged by a grease-stained rebel with a blowtorch. The implications were immediate. Allied bombers, which still flew at 280 mph, could now potentially be escorted by a fighter that doubled their speed. Defensive formations could collapse and reform instantly. Strafing runs could become hit-and-vanish strikes at 700+ mph. Dogfights would no longer be about angles. They'd be about reaction time. But the true collapse came behind the scenes. Within 48 hours, internal memos at Wright Field warned of unauthorized tech compromising project integrity. The Gloucester Meteor program issued a silent pause on new exports to U.S. allies. And worse, A classified recommendation circulated to destroy or detain any unsanctioned jet projects currently in field testing. Halley didn't just bend the rules, he exposed them. Because his flight proved that a single man, if skilled and reckless enough, could dismantle years of slow institutional engineering with parts the military had already thrown away. He didn't need $10 million. He needed clearance to be ignored. And once the Devil's Dart hit 740 maniasa, that truth couldn't be unlearned. In 2 minutes of flight time, Halley erased the concept of authorized innovation. He showed that the future of aerial dominance didn't belong to nations. It belonged to outliers, engineers with no chain of command, mechanics who skipped the paperwork, men who didn't wait for the war to catch up. And that made him the most dangerous kind of threat. Not to the Germans, to his own side, March 24, 1945, 3 days after the Dart's first flight. The air over Bavaria was thick with retreat. German divisions were pulling back through the southern corridor, clinging to mountain passes and flak nests. But in the sky, the Luftwaffe hadn't given up. Me-262s were still prowling at dusk, looking for wounded bombers to finish off before the Allies reached Munich. That afternoon, the 457th Bomb Group launched a strike on Augsburg's industrial zone, 12 B-17s escorted by a P-51 squadron. No one expected resistance. The Germans were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered. But halfway to the target, the sky cracked open. 3 Me-262s dropped from 28,000 feet, diving out of the sun with autocannons primed. The Mustangs turned, but they couldn't keep up. 2 bombers went down in 30 seconds. A third caught fire and veered off toward the Alps. In the chaos, one of the P-51s broke formation. But it wasn't a P-51. It was the Dart. Halley hadn't waited for orders. After his unauthorized test flight, he knew command was coming for him. So he took off again, before the hangar lights could be shut off. This time, he armed the jet. 2 50 cals mounted in the nose, barely tested. A stripped-down gyro sight installed from a wrecked Thunderbolt. He was 30 miles out when he caught the call. Bombers hit. Multiple 262s, no visual on support. He opened the throttle. What happened next wasn't a dogfight. It was a blur. Radar tracked the Dart moving through the engagement zone at 720 mph, outrunning even the German jets. Pilots on both sides lost visual the moment he entered. But seconds later, one of the M262s exploded mid-climb. No warning, just a burst of fire and twisted metal. Then Halley circled, tight, brutal, too fast, and lined up the second. The German pilot tried to break away, but the Dart closed the gap in under 4 seconds. A short burst of tracers stitched across the Me-262's left engine. Smoke poured. The fighter spiraled. The third 262 disengaged and climbed for cloud cover. Halley followed. For 40 seconds, they were ghosts. 2 aircraft that weren't supposed to exist, slicing through contrails above 30,000 feet. Then, a final flash. The last 262 banked too hard, lost lift, and vanished into a canyon near Garmisch. Halley returned to base with only 10 gallons of fuel and a cracked left wing. The ground crew said nothing. The radios stayed quiet. But one of the bomber pilots sent a note to command that night. A jet with no markings saved our whole flight. Don't know whose it was. Don't care. It moved like a bullet and hit harder. No cameras, no credit, just silence. But the Dart had killed 3 jets in under 2 minutes. And suddenly, the forbidden had become unstoppable. April 2nd, 1945, Eastern Czechoslovakia. What began as a recon mission turned into one of the most controversial air ops of the entire war. The Americans needed a route to Prague. Fast. Intel suggested the Luftwaffe was repositioning its last jet units near the Czech-German border, but they didn't know exactly where. So they crafted a trap, bait with a slow, visible formation, and see who bit. 2 P-38s were sent ahead, low and slow, pretending to scout rail yards. But circling above, invisible at 38,000 feet, was something else entirely. The Devil's Dart. Halley had been kept off the books since Bavaria. Officially, he didn't exist. But unofficially, commanders began treating him like a precision scalpel. only pulled out when it was too risky for anyone else. The trap was sprung over Pilsen. 3 Me-262s launched from a hidden field and climbed fast. The P-38s turned west, feigning panic. The jets followed. Then Halley dove. From almost 40,000 feet, the dart dropped like a missile. There was no warning, no contrail, just a growing shriek in the wind. He passed Mach 0.98 in descent. So close to breaking the sound barrier, the air around the jet shimmered. The first 262 didn't even have time to turn. Halley fired a 3-second burst. The tail disintegrated mid-roll. The second jet reacted, juking left, climbing. Halley followed, slinging his airframe through a 6G turn that should have torn it apart. He caught the Me-262 above Prague's city edge and fired again. Short, clean, surgical. 2 hits, 1 engine gone. The German ejected. But the third pilot had figured it out. He dove under Halley, using Prague's spires and rooftops for cover. The dart followed, low, erratic, reckless. Anti-air units opened fire from both sides, thinking both planes were hostile. At 400 feet, just above the Vltava River, the Me-262 banked hard over Charles Bridge, and Halley did the unthinkable. He cut thrust, reversed the flaps manually, and pivoted his tail rudder with full force, essentially skidding his jet mid-air. The dart's nose snapped to the right. He regained visual and squeezed the trigger. 1 shot. Clean. The German plane didn't explode. It just dropped. Silently, into the river. Halley pulled up seconds before hitting the bridge spires. His canopy cracked. Fuel lines screamed. But he climbed back into cloud cover and vanished. No one spoke about Prague in the after-action report. The mission was unrecorded. The kills unconfirmed. But radio intercepts picked up panicked Luftwaffe chatter that night. Black jet, no insignia, faster than ours, shoots from above. The trap worked. The jets were gone, and Halley had rewritten what one man could do. With one plane the world refused to admit existed. There was no plaque, no citation, no record in official history. But in the final weeks of the war, whispers of a black jet ricocheted through Allied command. It had no serial number, no markings, no official unit. It moved like a meteor, struck with surgical fury, then vanished into silence. Some said it was British, others claimed it was a Nazi prototype gone rogue. But those closest to the truth knew better. It was Halley, a mechanic who refused to wait, a rebel who turned a pile of broken machines into a weapon that terrified both enemies and allies. His creation didn't just defy orders, it shattered assumptions. The Devil's Dart outran doctrine. It rewrote what warplanes could be, not through budget or bureaucracy, but through boldness. In the skies over Bavaria and Prague, Halley forced the world to confront a new reality, that innovation was no longer controlled by generals or boards. It belonged to those willing to build without permission. He didn't build the fastest jet, he built the freest, and that made it lethal. After the war, the Dart was dismantled under orders. Its parts vanished into classified archives, its existence redacted from mission logs. Halley was offered a reassignment in exchange for silence. He declined, disappeared. But legends don't need medals. Pilots spoke of him in hangars long after VE Day. Radar techs remembered his signature, a spike of noise no Allied plane should have made. And in some corners of Europe, farmers still whisper about the night a jet screamed over the hills, faster than anything they'd ever seen. One man, one engine, one impossible idea forged from rust, rage, and refusal. That's all it took to make the Luftwaffe flinch, and the Allied war machine blush. Because when speed breaks rules, speed wins. And when they heard that sound, low, rising, ripping through the sky, they didn't think mechanic. They thought, death is coming. Long after the war ended, the sound still haunted those who heard it. That sudden scream in the sky, unnatural, unmatched, unforgettable. The Devil's Dart left no museum display, no surviving fuselage, no formal debrief. But it left something stronger, a myth, not of a plane, but of a man, A mechanic who refused to wait for permission, who looked at scrap and saw speed, who didn't ask what was possible, but what was necessary. Halley's story is more than wartime curiosity. It's a blueprint for something far deeper. That courage, when paired with craftsmanship, can break even the laws of war. That one human against doctrine and delay can change the trajectory of a generation. He didn't wear medals. He wore grease. He didn't follow orders. He outran them. And somewhere, deep in the silence of unrecorded skies, his jet still echoes. Not as a footnote, but as a challenge. To every engineer, every rebel, every outlier with a wrench and a wild idea, the sky is waiting, and the next myth is yours.